and it is beautiful. Now, of course, this does not look appealing at all, but that's not the point of it. The point of this is to give us an alpha channel, essentially, or a matte, for every single object in our scene. Now, it's very important that we render this out at least 16-bit, preferably 32-bit floating point. And the reason for that is this looks like a muddled mess of different colors, but what 3ds Max has actually done internally is it's given every single object a unique color ID. Now, if we do this with an 8-bit image, especially a lossy image like a JPEG, or even an 8-bit image like a Targa file, we can lose some information to the limited range of an 8-bit image. But with floating point, really the world is the limit. Now, there's a few things on this. You'll notice that each object is a specific color. There is no dithering, or anti-aliasing between the objects. We have very sharp lines, which we can deal with rather easily. And beyond that, the objects stay the same colors throughout their movement. And as they move, some objects may appear in similar places, but they will be, hopefully, a different color. Okay, so now let's take a look at how we can use this to gain control over our objects here in After Effects. So I'm going to jump back to that microphone comp and just drop in this object ID pass. Now again, let's go back to that thing, or the beginning problem we have is we want to change this color, or we want to modify its shading. So we need an alpha channel, or we need a mask. So let's turn on our object ID, and we can use keying to isolate any of these individual objects. Now, the proper keyer to use when in a 32-bit project with 32-bit source images is the linear color keyer. So on our object layer, let's go to our keyers, and let's grab a linear color key. And so now let's just grab whichever object we want to isolate. So in this case, I want to isolate this cylinder here. And you'll notice it disappears. And that can work for us, but I would actually prefer to only see this cylinder. So let's come in, and I'm just going to add another effect. I'm going to add a channel invert, and let's switch this from RGB down to alpha. And so we've just taken the alpha channel and flipped it. Now you'll notice if we solo this that a lot of these objects got grabbed. And that's because the linear color key by default is a little soft to deal with green screens. But in our case, we want it to be as sharp as possible. So let's set our matching softness to 0.1%. And this should isolate everything except for the object we had selected originally. Okay, great. So now we have this alpha channel that we can start modifying things with. So to do this, I'm just going to drop in an adjustment layer. Of course, you can edit things however you like. I like using adjustment layers. And let's drop in maybe something like an exposure node, or let's drop in a curves node just play around with it a little bit. And we'll use an alpha track matte here to isolate this adjustment layer only in this specific area. And let's give this a nice filmy S curve. And we can see that that is now only affecting this specific area. Now to really push this edit into overdrive to show the edge issues we're having, let's add in something like hue saturation. And let's just give this a hue shift to something more golden a little bit. Maybe up the saturation a little bit. Okay, that looks pretty good. Let's maybe dial back this curve just a little. Okay, great. So let's now take a look at the edge we currently have. And if we zoom in and we take a look at full res, you can see our edges are not quite yet perfect. And this is the one problem with Object ID passes, is that it's practically impossible to get perfect edges of every object without corrupting the data. So we're just going to have to sort of finesse it and massage the data a little bit to get it a little cleaner. So to begin with, on our Object ID pass, let's give this a slight blur. So we'll go blur sharpen, let's just give it a nice fast blur, repeat the edge pixels, anywhere between 1 and 3 pixels worth, let's say 3. Now that softens it out, but we can still see the original color behind this. So let's actually use a levels to push the alpha out just a little bit. So let's go to our color correction, and let's drop on a levels, And let's change the channel we're operating on from RGB to alpha. And now let's drag this down a bit until we get a nice edge. Okay, that might be a little far. So just keep playing with this until you get an edge that is as close as you want it. But we always have to be careful because, again, this edge is not going to be pixel perfect. But with a little manipulation, we can get it to the point where it's good enough. And now we have a very versatile alpha channel that we can now begin making changes to these objects. So to finish this off, all we'd have to do is continue either duplicating this layer and grabbing different linear color keys in a pre-comp. So let's take a look at that. So Control-Shift-C, and let's call this our object pass pre-comp. And in here, let's go in and let's just duplicate this. And I accidentally did not keep my layer inside, so Control-Shift-C. I do want to move all these attributes in. Object pass pre-comp. There we go. And now inside of here, we can duplicate this, turn off the effect, choose a new linear color key. So let's do this one now. And let's do this for the other two cylinders. So Control-D, duplicate that layer. Select the next area. Select the layer again and Control-D. Otherwise, you'll duplicate your effect. And let's select that. And then we could just turn back on all of our effects. Wham, our stuff is isolated. Jump back, and in no time, we have made pretty drastic changes to this without having to go in and do any hand rotoscoping or messy keying. And we have kept everything with our comp. And the great thing about the object pass is it is a render. So it works with however your camera movement is, whatever your motion blur is, everything. You can see here that we've made permanent changes to our composite that we really couldn't have, or it would have been much more time consuming to do without this pass. So as you can see, you can keep your creative control practically to the end of the compositing step if you output this pass correctly and you output it with your render. So as you can see, it does take a tiny little bit of work to set up, but once we have it set up, we can make incredible changes and have an extremely powerful tool on our hands to manipulate our 3D render all the way before we render it out of After Effects. So just to quickly wrap this up, I want to take a look at how we use this in the final comp. Now, our render artist did pick the nice colors for our comp, so we did not need to use it for this strong of an adjustment. But what I did do is I wanted to add a little animation to the sides of this. So what I did is took the Object ID pass, isolated each of these little buttons, and then have them light up along with the music. And so let's just take a quick look at this comp, how we achieved that. It was relatively simple. And if we go into our glowing buttons pre-comp, you can see we have our button animation and then the microphone. Real magic happens inside of this button animation area here. If we go forward a few frames, we can see that moving stripe. So let's jump into first layer buttons, and you're going to see a very uncoordinated comp, and I apologize at length for this, but this is essentially the Object ID pass duplicated and isolated for every single object that I wanted to grab. So from the very beginning of the animation, every single button that exists on this object, I've gone in, isolated a mask for, and kept them inside of this one pre-comp. And the great thing about this is it works even during times of heavy or fast animation. Okay, so with every single button isolated on its own object layer, now jump out, and we have just a 3D stripe here with our camera, and it's just in the 3D universe here, animated to have this really nice pulsing effect to go with the music. From there, we just isolate those buttons on those areas using that moving 3D stripe. And what this is essentially giving us at this point is an alpha channel for these buttons. Just take a second here. There we go, so we can see these buttons light up, and then inside of Glowing Buttons, I've just taken the microphone and done a few effects on it to make it seem brighter. And then with all of these buttons, with this nice yellow color, out here in the microphone, on that layer, actually that's on the in the Autodesk link, I've added 2 glows with various settings so that these buttons glow nicely. And so the effect of that looks as if it was created inside of the actual 3D render, but this is 100% created and controlled here in After Effects. And this is really just touching the iceberg of what the Object ID Pass can do for you as a compositor, as someone working in After Effects. So I'm just going to do a quick RAM preview and we can take a look at the button flashing, and that will wrap up looking at the Object ID Pass. So here's just a quick preview of that animation. As you can see, we can create effects and change our composite in ways that we really either could not in a practical time or was extremely difficult before having this Object ID Pass. So next time you're going to be rendering out of 3ds Max and you want to maintain creative control all the way to the end of the compositing step, make sure you render out a 32-bit Object ID Pass.